We are actually about to dive straight into our next panel, which will be about, unpacking a little bit more, not only from Launch Africa's perspective, but from some incredible individuals who make waves on the continent as well, and just start curating some of their information in discussion with Junaid now for a little fireside chat, to really get some other insights, from different sectors, different individuals on what's happening on the ground. So please welcome on the stage, and by the way, this was a very, very, very amazing last-minute addition. I'm so glad that she could make it and is here with us. Please welcome Chanel Ansah, who is solo GP and founder of Lightpace VC, one of the probably most active angel investors on the African continent, from London, here with us today. Chanel, welcome. Then we have Patrick Martin. Patrick and I only got to know each other personally recently, but the work that Patrick is doing between the continents is incredible. Patrick is both active as an angel investor in African startups from here, as well as an LP in African funds, so has an incredible insight into what is happening, and will be a great panelist to also bridge the knowledge gap in terms of how do we look at it from a European and German investor's perspective. So Patrick, thank you for joining us. And of course, if we're talking about the ecosystem, Christoph, so great to have you on this panel as well. I think the experiences that you are making with Africa Arena, I mean, you're probably seeing it by now, the impact that the work is having on the ground and the insights generated. So thank you for joining us on this, for this fireside as well. And what I'll do is I'll get all of you a glass of water, because we can feel the humid Berlin heat. We're getting to African levels, right? We are warming up, so I'll get you some water. And in the meantime, hand over to Junaid to guide through this chat, where we'll be unpacking some of the aspects in more detail. So here you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Mikhail. Yeah, so we are just going to... I be on the other side now. I can ask them some tough questions about my own presentation, which I love. Don't question the numbers, please. Different sources. Yeah, so today is just to go through what are some other insights from investors, ecosystem builders, fund managers, that we were able to sort of unpack even more. And then the role that I'm going to play is try to bring the startup founders' perspectives into the room as well. So, Patrick, let's start with you. You spend some time in South Africa every year. You are an active investor. You certainly won more than the 1,100 that I had on the presentation. Why do you are so aligned to investing in Africa, spending your own personal time there? What is it about that environment? What are you seeing that people here might not be so afraid with, that you see, that you think that they should know?
So, very, very good question. And I've been active in Africa for over 20 years. And I think that's one of the main reasons. I mean, you need to really feel and know and build the trust and build the relationships. So it's a much harder entry. So it's not like you hear a fund presentation to invest, but it's much longer story that make you really want to do this. But secondly and more recently, I really believe and I really see and really follow your long-term story and your long-term enthusiasm. And we've since I finished my studies in the late 90s, we always hoped Africa would be the next big thing. I remember the Economist cover in the late 90s where it said will be the African decade, and it was always 10 years out, and it's still 10 years out. But the numbers come closer to to make this happen, that we will experience the African decade and maybe many of them in our lifetime. And from what I see, and I've invested in a couple of companies, I've invested in your fund and some others, and I've invested in some startups that I've helped building. I think the prerequisites are coming together. But on the other hand, there are still so many gaps that need to be addressed, that cannot be addressed from our ecosystem alone. Like, let me point out something you started with. You showed that positive curve, like the population growth, the younger population, the GDP growth. The downside of this is, of course, that the GDP growth that we see is mainly driven by population growth. And it's actually slower than you've seen in many other markets with similar population growth like some time back. What is the problem here? The problem is that we don't have productivity growth. We don't have infrastructure growth that could enable that productivity growth. We have some leapfrog situations that you described in fintech, etc., but we still have so much lower productivity in most basic industries, from agriculture to manufacturing to healthcare, that the population that you've shown doesn't really reap the benefits in general. And that's something we have to think about. I mean, how do we overcome that challenge, that we have or enable productivity growth, that we enable infrastructure growth in a modern way, in a tech-enabled way. And fintech is a good example, but it's not sufficient. Yeah. So that's when I look at your numbers, we really have to think how to build better. So for example, like if I look at your numbers and you talk about tech ventures, I always ask me, where are the investors that do manufacturing? I mean, there's still no big manufacturer for, I don't know, consumer goods on the African continent. Nobody builds washing machines. It's completely stupid. It makes no sense. It would generate a profit. I mean, they buy like whiteware goods from like China and from Europe all the time, but there's no manufacturing. So we have to think about this as well. In parallel to tech ventures, we need to create that ecosystem probably in a bit more broader way. But long term, I completely share your enthusiasm. I promote your fund and some other funds. I mean, constantly I'm on some of your promotion events, and I think we will see 2 or 3 more years of growing interest, especially in Germany and Europe.
Yeah, and certainly, Patrick, what you mentioned is vital for the future sustainability. I think where we're at now, this is obviously a long race, right? Where we're at now is the tech that is built doesn't require government engagement, right? Except maybe for fintechs with a central bank, but you know, even then, it's been quite a loose policy. Where you are, and your comment is that requires government intervention. And so because you need policies, you need infrastructure, you need the ability to engage with the right partners. We're getting there, but it's baby steps, right? Certainly, infrastructure development is the most fundamental thing that is going to drive African economies, not the technology revolution, right? It's the infrastructure, because people always would require infrastructure for everything. Even in the financial services, you need the CCOM, you need the telecommunications lines to be there, the towers, for the communication to happen. We need more people in our world pushing policy makers, right? I think we're in a phase where it's great to be an investor, you're focusing your portfolio companies, but maybe 25% of your time is doing the hard work, those conversations that take 10 years to unlock. But Chanel, I was going to come to you because obviously you look at different markets. You look at Europe and Africa, and you're based in London where there's a lot of engagement with startups to bring innovation in all sectors, including government, right? So how do you think we're going to cross that bridge in Africa?
I was just thinking when Patrick was speaking about infrastructure and how it is a basis of growth and economic development. You know, we're in the game of venture, you know, so we like to hack things and reverse engineer. And so I guess my next comment is more of a question and a challenge. And my question is, can we use technology to reverse engineer the advancement of the infrastructure needed, right, to contribute towards positive GDP, towards the kind of betterment of how people live on the continent, and do things in that way? Because actually, you know, there's a lot of attention right now on the continent of Africa with regards to tech. And so governments are paying attention. You know, we were in Marrakesh last week at a GITEX conference, and I would say there were probably about 50 leaders across the continent of Africa there, because today they now understand that it is of importance. And so some of the conversations that were being had were, what can we do? What policy changes do we need to make sure that we support this new age of digitization across the continent? So I think actually tech is playing a role in advancing those conversations and pushing them to wake up. So it's not necessarily a top-down approach. I actually think it's now a bottom-up approach. And we've seen a similar thing in the UK as well, where us at the bottom, we're not quite the bottom, but you know, at the bottom have been able to influence government and change policy. You know, a couple of months ago, we had one of our biggest technology banks, Silicon Valley Bank, go down. And in a space of 24 hours, the tech community, including a number of VCs, rallied, actually, and pulled their weight and was able to reverse the government's decision. That has never happened. So that's one example of where actually there's quite a lot of power in tech. And because people understand the importance of it, we can actually use that power to facilitate conversations with government officials and those that have the power to drive policy change. And so I think it's possible.
And Christoph, you definitely bottom up because you're building the ecosystems, right? And you're activating them, you're giving life to them. So what are some of your concerns? Because you in your pipeline is talent, making sure that people get the exposure, is building those communities, because you want those startups to come into your fray, right? So what are some of the things that you're concerned of in the other on the other side of the spectrum?
Well, I think the first point is that for us, when we started this initiative at a humble level, you know, one of our goals was on the narrative side. The talent is probably the biggest story on the African continent, and it's not an intuitive one. So I always tell this story, especially when I go to the US, that Amazon elastic computing technology was actually engineered by two South African engineers at the Cape Town R&D Center of Amazon back in 2006. So these two guys then started another startup called Nimbula, which was acquired by Oracle. So one could say, you know, the planet's cloud computing technology is actually, you know, born in Africa. You know, we can say the same about mobile payments. So there's a lot of talent on the continent, but those success stories are not well known, or were not well known. So I think we've been focusing very much on trying to explain that Africa has a wealth of talent, and as you mentioned in your presentation, you know, from very interesting ecosystem like Nairobi or Cape Town, quite cost effective in a global environment. The founders coming out of this talent pool, unfortunately, have not been enabled by a lot of capital. I mean, I was giving the number that when we started, we were at $300 million. So we're now at $6 billion. That's great, but it's still less than 1% of the global pool of VC money. Now, the only thing that attracts money is money, right? So you need success stories. And, you know, we've been working very hard on showcasing startups to, you know, for exit readiness and support that. So I remember last year we had Karim Begui from InstaDeep at Africa Arena. And a few months later, they exited to BioNTech. Incidentally, for the fan of the Tunisian ecosystem. I just got the news this morning that Expensia, which is probably one of the top 3 startups in Tunisia, has just signed an exit deal with a European company. So I think those exit stories create the narrative that actually there is return yielded by those ventures, and that will attract more money. Because let's not forget that the bulk of the money currently invested in our funds, and you're one exception, and I'm so admirative of the work you and Zach do, is DFI money. Yeah. And DFI is a very slow, structured, and comes with lots of terms and conditions and so forth. So we need to attract other source of capital, and for that we need to produce good exits. And that's an ecosystem play. So we need to all work together to do that. And I think, just to finish, I think the work that Launch Africa has done in the early stage for me is remarkable because, I mean, in the 7 years that I've seen, we don't have a lot of funds taking the risk, having the guts to invest in seed to post-seed startup stage, and you've been doing that. And we need more success stories like Launch Africa. We need you to get your fund 2 on the road, and for me that's the key focus. Perfect. The ecosystem.
So Patrick, to you, talking about attracting more money, you obviously have celebrated corporate life, and I want to talk about this engagement between startups and corporates. When you were on the other side, what was important for you in terms of, should I work with a startup? Are they going to add value? Are they just going to waste my time? Just give us some of your insights as a corporate executive that some of the startups in the room could have a top tip of when they're engaging with a corporate.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that quite prominently well in your presentation, that corporates do benefit tremendously from the innovation power and speed and creativity of startups. I mean, innovation is a very, very slow process in corporate culture. So when we, and even the cooperation with startups is a very difficult process to manage in a corporate culture. But whenever that worked, it works mostly for strategic reason. You need certain capabilities, certain tools. You want to jumpstart into certain new product levels, new markets. Then it can be, and it very often is beneficial to engage with startups to do that. I mean, examples is, I mean, I've developed logistics concepts. So example is, you want to jump into new technologies, for example, I don't know, electrification of deliveries. So it is probably much easier to have that developed in conjunction with a startup than to develop this in your own operational department, because they're very stuck in quality and process thinking, and not so much in inventing and developing new things. So you as a startup need to understand the corporate and the corporate goals very well. You need to understand what are their core capabilities, what are the market efficiencies, and then you have to offer the right innovation. So the right innovation is often not very difficult. It can be a very small thing. The process to convince a corporate, and you have done that in South Africa, is not an easy one. So it's not always the easiest route to work with a corporate. But no, in general, I mean, we see some great examples. We see some great examples for Africa. I mean, even the logistics companies I've worked with have invested directly or in partnership contracts into some of
DHL?
Yes. DHL and some others, but yeah. So we see some good benefits there.
Yeah, I always tell startup founders, do your research.
Yes.
Make sure that you know who you're speaking to, and because the manager executive has got a personal agenda. They might want to get a promotion, or they understand what you are fulfilling in their personal agenda. Provide the right solution to do that. And when you get in the door, don't get too excited, right? Make sure that you get external advice on the contract you sign, the term sheet, because it's very attractive to be working with a corporate, but some of the terms can be quite restrictive for your future growth, because often they want you to be aligned to their needs first. So just always get external advice when you sign a contract or when you sign any sort of term sheet with a corporate. Christoph, to you, you see a lot of startups come present, and you travel all continent. So tell me about the technologies that you are excited about at the moment, but then more specifically in this environment, I'm seeing a lot of Web3, obviously blockchain and AI, and where do you think Africa is in that adoption?
Yeah, so maybe two remarks there. First of all, on the point that Chanel made, which I think very relevant, if you combine the point I've mentioned on the wealth of talent, tech and entrepreneurial that we have in Africa, the fact that there's a scarcity of capital, and the fact we have serious issues related to infrastructure and the population growth, a lot of African startups are focused on solving very fundamental innovation. Take about climate adaptation or mitigation. We have a lot of startups that are busy in all corners of Africa trying to solve problems to turn a desert into arable land, to ensure that there are better forecasting system for farmers, that we have marketplace solution for people working in agribusiness and so forth. So whether it's water scarcity, electricity scarcity like we're currently suffering from in South Africa big time, or just adaptation to huge urban growth, mobility issues, logistics issues, you see incredible founders working in a very productive way because they don't have a lot of capital. So just my experience seeing these hundreds of startups every year is that the potential return, because you have founders that are very disciplined in using the little capital they have to deliver and scale their startups, is the very best of them are going to produce incredible returns. Now, also, the second remark is that contrary to what you would think that Africa is low tech, they're just solving mobility issues and so forth, I think the exits like, the InstaDeep one, complex AI technology born in design in Africa, actually used by large, European corporate, BioNTech, to help solve a global issue, COVID-19, because I don't know if you know, but InstaDeep AI technology was at the core of the design and the AI-based testing for the development of COVID-19 vaccine, which is why they got acquired by BioNTech, because the technology becomes so critical. So Africa can also do deep tech, can also do hardware. Don't go with the assumption that we're just doing marketplace for their fruits. There's a lot of variety for solving essential problems, but also for providing very innovative deep tech solution to those problems. So, hence, come and go on the field and attend these events to watch the startups, invest in the fund that are investing there. And if you're a corporate, you need an Africa plan, for sure.
Absolutely, and I think this is the key call to action here for both corporates and startups, that we need to build a much wider ecosystem in Africa. So we need to build manufacturing, and we need to build energy, and we need to build infrastructure, which cannot be done by the startups themselves, but they need to entice this by building the components. I mean, an example I always try to give, it's very difficult to move around in Africa, to move goods around in Africa for logistical reasons, for infrastructure reasons. I mean, as soon as you leave the major cities, the roads become a little bit more complicated to maneuver. The internal customs process between countries is still very, very cumbersome and bureaucratic, although there are very good political advancements with the introduction of the free trade zone, etc. So if you as a startup solve one of these components in a very easy and clever way, that could help attract the other part. I mean, attract, I don't know, a manufacturing plant, because they might postpone the decision just because of one component that's missing. And I've seen that. For example, I've seen this issue of not being able to move goods between custom systems, from one country to another, because just the IT integration infrastructure is just not there. If you could solve that problem, build like an automated custom system for certain processes. That would help and make many decisions for other parts much, much easier. So we should think about those things. I think we shouldn't think about building the next coolest SaaS platform, but about those things. They can be hugely profitable, and they can grow to a very large revenue and profit base.
There's a Tanzanian founder in the room, Amo. I hope you are taking notes. Okay. He's building something similar
Super.
in Tanzania.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Chanel, coming to the crystal ball part of this conversation, right? The future is so uncertain. Both of us have good track records, but we're raising money, capital, for our next fund because this is the journey we want to do. So how are you changing your fundraising strategy in this downturn?
Great question. I think first, if there are founders in this room, if you are a VC or general partner raising for your fund, there's no difference between you and us. I always say this, we're in the same space, raising money to build something that we care about. So I'm no different to you. So I always say this, so I get it. It's challenging, and I think right now in this market, you need to work on relationship building. I spent the first half of this week at a very big conference called Superventure that had a number of limited partners and venture capital funds, their kind of relationship building. And my goal was just to relationship build because it's a long game, especially when the market is not as great as it is. Something that I am trying to do is go to spaces where they are not aware of all the phenomenal things that are happening on the continent of Africa and educating them about all the great things that are happening and getting them excited. And so that is what I'm spending a lot of my time doing. That is where I'm putting a lot of my effort. And I think that is where I'll probably raise the most amount of money. I mean, unfortunately, tech and investment, venture capital investment on the continent, especially early stage, is still in its infancy. We mentioned earlier for your presentation, a lot of the startups are still in the early stage. There aren't that many exits. There isn't that much data to build the business case. So you need to spend a lot of time talking about pipeline and what it could look like. And also say, don't miss out. You say don't miss out. You go back to the dot-com boom and all the investors and LPs that didn't back the tech businesses that were being built then that have gone on to be some of the first unicorns, right? You say you missed out then because you were risk adverse, don't miss out now. So I guess that's my continuous message when I am speaking to potential investors and talking about what I am trying to build with Lightpace VC. And I think, both Christoph and Junaid talked about investors on the continent. I'm a slightly different case. I'm from the diaspora. My family's originally from Ghana in West Africa, but I spent a lot of time on the continent. But because there is a need, right? So my background is I used to run a fund in the UK called Cornerstone. It was the UK's first black-owned investment fund, investing in black and diverse founders. And early stage. And I think through exposure and interest and also understanding need, but also understanding the opportunities that were available on the continent is what has driven me to build Lightpace VC and focus on investing in Africa as well as Europe, because there is a need. I think this is where the diaspora and other investors outside of the continent need to work on channeling funding to startups on the continent, because the only way we're really going to get those success stories and case studies, to your point earlier, Junaid, we need to come together, right, to close these funding rounds, and that's how we're going to do it.
Yeah. We're going to head to Q&A. I have one question to Christoph and Patrick. For maybe the audience or the startups that's online, we often think about others helping Africa. But we also have to create a culture of Africa to the world. So the advice, any advice on how an African startup founder sitting in Ghana, Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire at the moment listening to this, and they want to expand to Germany or they want to expand to France, what is your 1 or 2 top tips that they need to think about?
So it has always been one of the themes that I believe for African founders. I mean, I think it shouldn't be the main theme, but it's one of the themes that the Africa talent base, in their unique creativity and resilience, they have an experience that can be matched with their fantastic education and the availability of now access to all the online tools, etc. You can build solutions that are easily better or can be used in European, Latin American, or other markets in Southeast Asia, etc. A good example, you just mentioned Cote d'Ivoire. I just traveled with your partner Zach. I was in Benin, and we met one of the few positive examples of a SaaS company developing a consumer experience software, and their majority of sales is outside Africa. They actually have subscribers that are in other markets because the solution they have built was so low cost and so resilient and so adaptable that other markets that are also maybe emerging or second-tier markets saw that and adapted that solution. So there's a lot of potential for African developers to sell their solution to other markets. Coming to selling it to Germany specifically might be a challenge because you need to understand two things. Like, you need to understand the market gap in Germany, and you need to build the connection between Africa and Germany. So there are a couple of things being done right now in the trade and logistics area to open up export trade from African markets to German and European consumer and retailer markets, so African products. And unfortunately, there are not too many. There's not too much produced yet in Africa, but I think the market here is huge. There's a huge interest to move import from China and Asia to other markets. So if you could build something that enable, especially German wholesalers and manufacturing supply chains to import stuff from Africa in an easy way and a useful way, that I think would be the main issue. Identify something that can be produced in Africa, that can be specifically sourced from Africa, and I think the market for that is wide open in Germany right now. Everybody wants to relocate supply chains. Everybody wants to build and diversify their supplier base. So I think that should be a focus.
Christoph,
Yeah, I'd complement that. I always say founders, go big or go home. Often you see the founders, especially at seed level, they're thinking for their local market, even their city, and say, no, guys, you have to build something that is going to be able to scale and produce, the exit that you want. Have the exit in mind when you start, not on the way. And it's very hard to enter European market, US market. We've seen a lot of failures in that area. In South Africa and elsewhere. Yet, what you can see from the exit data is north of 80% of the exit actually came from corporates or large companies outside of Africa. I was mentioning BioNTech, Expensia, but on the fintech sector, we've seen acquisition from US players in Nigeria, for example, and many others. So you have to sell to a global player at some point, whether it's through an open innovation partnership, and it's going to enable you to think globally and to scale your startup beyond your original market. Yet I think one of the differentiators of African founders is that they really understand African markets, even if they're quite different, and have an advantage over European or US players in scaling their ventures in the territory. And I think one of the play for the coming years, and I always look at the trends, not just the dots, and we are very optimistic about the market. We think VC market in Africa will hit $10 billion within the next 5 years. If you look at all the GDP capita data, the investment per capita data, we should be hitting $30 billion in the next 20 years, 20, 30 years. So the market is going to grow for sure. You need to build ventures that are going to be attractive for exits or partnership with global players. And that means working with European, US, Asian corporates. You've got to be open. And so part of your venture development has to be, maybe spend a bit less time in fundraising, but a bit more time in selling to global clients like corporates. It's quite key.
Our board chair lady reminds me every 5 minutes to do that. But we're going to open the room to questions. This is your opportunities to ask really tough questions on the three panelists, not me. And so just give your name, just who you work for, and then ask your questions.
Whilst you're thinking of your questions, on the international expansion piece, I would say reach out to the local department trade centres in the different countries, because quite often they have programs to facilitate expansion from the continent to different places in Europe. So I know in England we have it. We have the Department for International Trade. They run a number of programs every year for international expansion, where they will work with you to help you build a business that is ready for that international expansion. And I'm sure a number of other countries across Europe also do the same. So reach out and have those conversations sooner rather than later.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the great insights. I'm Marcus, I'm co-founder of DoDash, an investor relations platform, which is also operating in Africa. And I was wondering, Chanel, when you were talking, and you also talked a lot in general about policy making, and how far do you see a difference when it comes down to policy regulations, when it comes down to climate tech, for example? Because in Germany, there's a lot of bureaucratic processes that delay some of that, and COVID and everything has accelerated that in the war. But what type of differences do you see on the African continent compared to European continent in which you're investing?
As much as there is bureaucracy in certain European markets, especially within the EU, it is a lot more advanced, believe it or not, when it comes to climate policy and the advancement of climate policy. What I've seen is that on the continent, a lot of, especially in the major markets, are looking to the West to see what policies have been put in place and what mandates have been approved, and they are using that as a guideline and a blueprint. So as painful as it is, and I have seen some of the reporting requirements in Europe around climate and all the red tape you have to get through, it is significantly more advanced. I would say on the continent of Africa, it's still in its infancy, and it has a long way to go. We'll see, climate on the continent of Africa, for me and probably for all of us, is a very important one, because it is one of the continents that is the most adversely impacted but contributes the least. Climate tech is still in its infancy on the continent, but I think in the next sort of 5 years, we're going to see some major players spin out, because right now a lot of problems are happening, and as everyone on the panel has mentioned, Africans are building for solutions that are affecting them at home first, and climate is definitely affecting Africans on the continent right now.
This is a very, very interesting aspects, because climate, again, in Africa is a similar leapfrogging thing like communication was. So a lot of climate investment will be done because to solve basic energy needs. And it's just cheaper to move to climate-friendly solutions than trying to go through a 5-year planning or 10-year planning process for a nuclear power station. It will be cheaper and more effective to have a broad-based solar rollout. And there will be a necessity to do that. And it's not only because of policies, although they're already good policies, but it's because of economic sensibility to move to climate-friendly solutions. So storage and solar and wind and water production, you see a lot of initiatives, especially in markets that are energy constrained, like South Africa, like Nigeria, where where the economy is the driver, not the policy. And that's really interesting. And I would say that's a very important field to discover. I just want to mention one example. For example, like you see a lot of microgrid solar developing in Africa, in many markets. Microgrid solar, very often financed from here. And I'm just working with one founder that develops, or one founder team, like a company. They develop a software to connect microgrids into a structured grid and then enable the selling and of the power to small businesses. So have sensors, basic digital meters, smart meters, and the whole prediction of production software behind that. And they've developed a system that is actually easy to use and advanced enough in its AI prediction of power generation that we have now attracted 2 European utilities, small-scale utilities in a good European market. They actually look at their software now, which is really, I mean, we have had first meetings now, which is an interesting, so they never thought of the European market. They're actually from Zimbabwe. So like a small country in comparison, but the technology they've built is cool enough because they basically built this for a real use case. So, and we now think, can we use this in European markets as well? So there's also big potential.
If we're looking around policy around Africa, there's this organization called the African Union. It's our equivalent of the EU. They drive policy. Then every country has to adopt their frameworks for that policy. And then it's the implementation, which is often where we struggle with, right? So Africa is amazing at policies. Absolutely. But it's the implementation. So you want to almost check with the AU, then filter into that country that you're interested in, and then look at how they actually implement it. That's the 3 pillars. One last question. We're running, two. I see your hand. Sorry.
So I was wondering, my name is Pearl and I'm a student here at Code. I was wondering if on this conversation we're also thinking about policy making in regards to creativity in the education system, because I grew up in Ghana, and so I'm super excited to see Chanel, by the way. And I wonder what policy is being done to ensure that there's creativity in the education system, because I feel like one of the things that I felt like I was not equipped with is the idea of creative confidence to, that fosters that ability to believe that we can create things, that we can innovate on the continent, and to even think about those things, because usually we're not thinking about that until we're exposed to places like this where we see people creating and doing phenomenal things, and then we begin to feel like, oh, actually, so I could also create something. So I'm curious what is going on in the continent with that regard.
Yeah, maybe I'll comment on that quickly. I'm sure Chanel will also have some reaction. But on the regulation question, which touches onto that, one of the major restrainer of the ecosystem historically, and it's still very much the case, is the fact that we have very restrictive, obsolete, sometimes regulation in place with regards to intellectual property, or with regards to capital flow in many African countries. If you look at, most of even the top ecosystem like South Africa, we suffer from when you want to take money out the country. If you're an investor, you invest in. When you get your proceeds out, you got to get all sorts of approvals from the Reserve Bank. There's a famous story that one of the first exits in South Africa by Mark Shuttleworth, he couldn't take his money out the country. So he had to sue the regulator and actually failed. So fortunately, a number of African countries like Tunisia have started putting in place more modern approach to this, which is what they call startup acts. In fact, Digital Collective Africa, we're very involved in advocacy work to push startup acts across the continent. and more holistically than that, startup plans to remove the red tape, which is inhibiting founders like you to start from Ghana a business if you're going to have all sorts of constraints, and also to enable more foreign direct investment from VC without having you to put your company in Delaware, because it's an issue. So right now the Delaware thing is a workaround. But we've seen a Startup Act in Tunisia, and if you see these big exits now, it's because they started 6 years ago with the Startup Act, and it's many levels, including at university level, to enable tech founders to get the capital and really scale a company quickly. There are in progress Startup Acts in various countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Mali, 7, South Africa. I'm very involved in that, unfortunately, our government is very slow to act, but yes, there is a lot of things happening, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it's probably the most important regulation we have to do is cut the regulation, cut the red tape, and just enable.
I'll be very quick. It starts with education. So I can speak for Ghana because I know a lot about what's going on right now. There's an organization, if you have links to Ghana, called Foundivine, and they're working on changing the education and the way the youth are educated, and in the way that they have historically been taught to learn is very different to the way that we are taught to learn in the West. In the West we are taught to challenge, to be innovative. In Ghana, to be quite frank, you were taught to recite, and retain. And that doesn't fuel innovation. So the work that Foundivine are doing in Ghana is exactly the opposite of that. There are a number of STEM programs. So I would say if you're looking for the groups that are doing the work on the ground, look for the ones that are trying to implement STEM programs in early stage educational programs across the continent, because they are trying to change this.
Cool. Sorry, guys, I have to cut this amazing panel short now, but, be prepared. We have an amazing networking opportunity coming up over lunch, just in a few moments. But yeah, why don't we just give a massive, massive hand to our amazing panelists for sharing so much wisdom and insights into the market. Guys, I'm standing here and I'm just really, really happy that something like this, for me, this is the day-to-day business that I strive on, right? And it's almost this little bubble, where we're all so excited about the development of the ecosystem, the potentials, but also the challenges. Yet it really excites me to bring this to Berlin, and I hope that a lot of you gain some valuable insights from today's summit, as well as actually this is the perfect opportunity to also over lunch and later on meet each other and exchange information, thoughts, develop collaborations, develop great meaningful conversations on how together, and we're back to the term family, can continue to build bridges between the continents.